The next series of exercises encompass the flow patterns. Flow exercises introduce rotational inertia generated by the kettlebell, but hold the inertia to create stability-managed propulsion. This will place a greater emphasis on the trunk and hips in the management of the kettlebell's position. The around-the-body pass is commonly used to introduce the kinetic flow movement technique. To start, hold the kettlebell in one hand while standing upright with the feet hip-width apart. The grip can be pronated or neutral. Some find the neutral grip easier to manage the blind handoff. If using a pronated grip, it is easier to do the blind handoff if your grip is slid to one side of the handle. Keeping your hips and knees slightly flexed, or soft knees, and your chest elevated with the shoulders back, start to slowly move the kettlebell in a circular motion laterally to a position behind your hips. Once the bell is directly behind you, smoothly switch hands and use the momentum to bring the kettlebell back in front of you, roughly just above waist height, consistent with a 30% swing. At the top of the swing, when the kettlebell feels weightless, switch hands again. Control the descent around your hips and manage the path around and behind you, avoiding bodily contact. The movement can be completed with very minimal hip extension at first and progressed into a 30% swing. Make sure to complete the movement in both directions. The most common error with the around-the-body pass, besides dropping the kettlebell at the transition, is allowing the momentum of the kettlebell to cause your hips to rotate. Your hips should remain square throughout this movement. The kettlebell halo exercise uses the same concepts of rotational inertia as the around-the-body pass, but the placement around the head also challenges shoulder girdle mobility and strength. Start by standing in an erect posture with your feet hip-width apart, holding the kettlebell upside down by the horns at shoulder height. Initiate the movement by pivoting your arms around your head a quarter turn so the bell is being held just above your shoulder. Continue the motion around the back of your head, using the alternating rise and fall of your arms to control the height of the kettlebell until it is above the other shoulder. Return back to the starting position. You can continue around the same direction or alternate clockwise and counterclockwise each rep. Similar to the around-the-body pass, your hips and chest should remain neutral with minimal cervical spine movement. Common errors during the halo include going too slow or too fast. While precision is key, this movement is still intended to develop rotational inertia control. Always encourage fluidity in movement. And dropping the kettlebell too low in the front position. The hands should not drop below the chest with this variation. Using too heavy of a kettlebell promotes this issue. The figure 8 drill similarly flows with a captured control of rotational inertia, but now challenges you to exchange hands while the kettlebell travels between the legs. This movement functions as a pseudo-swing to assist with connecting rotational stability with athletic hip and knee extension movements. Begin to swing the kettlebell slowly through your legs from front to back. Control the swing pattern to bring the kettlebell through your legs and switch hands in a smooth handoff. Continue the circular path around the outside of the leg and into a 30 to 50% swing. Control the descent of the kettlebell through your legs, handing the kettlebell off to the other arm and repeating the motion around the other leg and into a swing. Continue this motion for a set number of reps and then switch directions. Throughout the movement, some side-to-side and slight rotation at the hips and ankles is acceptable, but it should resemble shifting your weight around like an athlete in the ready position. There should not be significant translation movements, and be sure to avoid flexing the spine. Common errors of the kettlebell figure 8 swing include losing fluidity during the handoff. The switch from hand to the other is difficult and requires practice. And swinging the kettlebell too far lateral from the body. Make sure you are controlling the kettlebell as it travels from behind and outside of your leg. The stability should be provided by the shoulder girdle at this point. Kettlebells have become a popular modality among fitness enthusiasts and exercise professionals alike who are drawn to the diversity of exercises possible using the uniquely shaped resistance device. It is the shape of the kettlebell that provides its utility as a standalone modality or an adjunct to traditional resistance training. Kettlebells come in varying sizes as they suit different purposes. The sizes and the way the bells are used determines the effect on both health and performance-related components of fitness. This suggests the kettlebell can be used for metabolic workouts, to improve strength and power, and even provide improved mobility and balance. These adaptation benefits are far-reaching and have utility across a broad population. So, let's explore this interesting modality further. While the kettlebell may seem like a fairly novel invention, its history actually dates back to the 18th century. Kettlebells were originally used by Russian farmers as weights for scale measures of grains, dry goods, and animal products. They were made in different sizes relative to the weights needed for the farmed product. This inspired farmhands to challenge each other to lift the heaviest bells. The Soviet Union found additional functionality for kettlebells, subsequently employing applicable training for soldiers and athletes. Today, kettlebells are a common gym item sold throughout the world. While a kettlebell has a handle and is commonly manufactured in the same weight segments as dumbbells, they are different by design. Whereas a dumbbell places the center of gravity in the hand, the kettlebell's gravity is shifted downward away from the handle. This promotes increased rotational inertia, as evidenced by its unique swinging ability compared to other resistance devices. The kettlebell actually has three parts: a bell, a handle, and the horns. While kettlebells have taken on some different looks, they all have a bell that represents the weight's center of mass. The horns connect the handle to the bell and are usually angled, providing for additional grip positions. The kettlebell can be grasped by the handle, horns, or its bell end for different lifts and purposes. Kettlebells have morphed from their historical farm presence to a variety of modifications across production. Some use a consistent handle size, while others adjust the handle to the size of the bell. Some have vertical horns, whereas others have angled horns. Some allow for the weight to be adjusted using plates, whereas others are fixed. They also come in different materials including iron, steel, rubber, or plastic-coated composite. The classic kettlebell is a solid weight made of cast iron and offers a round bell and curved handle, which provides for a wide range of uses. Competition bells, on the other hand, use a straight handle for contested lifts like the clean and snatch. When selecting a kettlebell for training, it should fit properly from the outside knuckle of the index finger diagonally down to the opposite side of the wrist, and the handle should not be too thick to cause added grip fatigue. Likewise, when held up, it should not impinge the bony profile of the wrist, but rather lay upon the forearm when the wrist is straight. Whereas traditional resistance training has been used to isolate and target specific muscle groups, kettlebells more commonly focus on movements. The bell provides inertial forces that must be managed across the movement's range and contained within an arm's length. Consider a traditional Romanian deadlift. It uses a controlled speed of dynamic muscle contractions across its complete range, whereas an RDL swing with a kettlebell uses ballistic force which increase with the speed of the bell. The faster it moves, the more force it generates. It is the flow of the bell that enhances the kinetic activity of the local and global stabilizers, contributing to improved movement proficiency and force management. This suggests the bell has added utility for many exercises, particularly for kinetic chain energy management. So rather than isolate groups of muscles, it coordinates groups of movements for added adaptational benefits. This explains why kettlebells can be effective in several areas of health and performance development, including metabolic fitness. Many kettlebell activities require significant contribution from functional segments of the body, which increases metabolic requirements and cardiopulmonary responses, consequently contributing to heightened caloric expenditure. An added feature of the kettlebell occurs by its design. Certainly, the bell can be used for traditional exercises, including shoulder presses, bicep curls, and standing tricep extensions. but the activation and challenge are heightened due to the fact the center of mass of the bell lies outside the body to one side. Whereas dumbbells are equally balanced in one's hand, the position of the bell relative to the handle increases inertial forces, adding to the exerciser's difficulty. As mentioned earlier, when the bell speeds up, so do the bodily forces used to manage it. So a kettlebell swing to press from the nested position, for instance, would require greater management than the kettlebell dynamic press due to added rotational inertia. This holds true with all kettlebell movements across all elevated velocities. The following kettlebell pressing series serves to transfer developed upper body strength into total body power. Pressing overhead is useful for introducing the kettlebell into strength training. It provides for a stable action to gain experience with the unique loading of the kettlebell. Once mastered, movement dynamics transition to ballistic work. The kettlebell single arm press starts from the front rack position. If the exerciser does not know how to perform a kettlebell clean, the bell can be handed to them. From the front rack position, make sure your forearm is vertical, with the wrist neutral and not rotated. Start by taking a deep breath in to inflate your entire thoracic cavity. This will lift the bell slightly off your chest. Next, brace the trunk and press the kettlebell overhead by simultaneously abducting the humerus and extending the arm. Your hand and bell will angle backwards to the finishing position with the shoulder and elbow fully locked out overhead. Your raised arm should block the posterior aspect of your ear. To lower the kettlebell, simultaneously flex your elbow while horizontally adducting the shoulder. This will bring your elbow and kettlebell back in line for a vertical forearm in the front rack position. The two most common errors of the single arm kettlebell press include pressing the kettlebell in front or to the side of your body. This will make holding the final position very difficult, so many exercisers lean in the opposite direction. Correct this error by reducing the weight and properly cueing the movement. Shoulder mobility might also need work, with an emphasis on latissimus dorsi and pectoralis major range of motion. And not lowering the kettlebell in the correct path. You can practice bumping and returning a light kettlebell to the front rack position to ingrain the path. Similar to the single arm press, the double kettlebell press starts from the front rack position. Begin by ensuring both forearms are vertical and the wrists are neutral, with the kettlebells resting on the forearms and lateral aspect of the humerus. Take a deep breath and brace the trunk before pressing upwards, pushing through both forearms as the wrists migrate upward with the handles of the kettlebells. As the kettlebells rise, the center of mass of both bells should angle backwards slightly, so that at the top position, the center of the kettlebell is even with your elbows, shoulders, hips, and ankles. Once the terminal position is reached, lower the kettlebells in the same manner as the single kettlebell press, but with both arms returning to the start position simultaneously. Leaning too far back is a common error during the concentric phase of the press, as the body erroneously uses chest musculature and the lower back. Cue the athlete to brace the core throughout the lift. In the transition from dynamic contractions to ballistic contractions, we employ the hitch press. The kettlebell hitch press is basically a cheating single arm press. From the front rack position, first, slightly flex your hips and knees evenly to drop about 2 to 3 inches. Using a bounce-like reaction under a braced torso, quickly extend the hips and knees like a piston to bump the kettlebell off of your chest. This bump should lift the kettlebell at least 2 to 3 inches to gain optimal mechanical advantage via positioning and momentum. While performing the rapid extension, ride the momentum to press through the kettlebell with a neutral wrist and a vertically maintained forearm until the arm is fully extended overhead. This places the kettlebell directly over the shoulder. The most common errors of the hitch press include not using the hips and torso to efficiently lift the kettlebell. This can be fixed by practicing just the bump with a lighter kettlebell. And overflexing the knees, creating an uneven hip-knee relationship. The piston maneuver should be mastered before heavier loads are employed to evade this issue. As mentioned, the hitch press is the foundation for more aggressive ballistic pressing. This suggests the hitch should be mastered before the push press is attempted. The push press employs much more deliberate use of your hips and legs to drive the kettlebell overhead. From a front rack position, simultaneously flex the hips and knees about 15 degrees while keeping the chest up and heels flat. Ensure a balanced piston stance through the descent. At the bottom of the eccentric position, rapidly extend the hips and knees simultaneously while maintaining a braced torso. This will allow the kinetic energy to pass through the hand. The legs drive the weight, so once the bell starts to move, continue the upwards motion of the energy by pressing the kettlebell directly overhead as seen during other pressing movements. During the lift, it is expected that the heels will leave the ground as the ankles extend, following the hips and knees. Common errors of the push press include allowing the knees to cross the toes and not performing any flexion at the hips. This can occur when the center of mass is too forward. To correct this, start in a static piston position so the stretch shortening cycle is removed. And not timing the press with the upper momentum created. This causes a delayed press and loss of energy. The second part of our functional exercise series starts with the lateral kettlebell swing. This swing integrates frontal plane movements into a workout. It is a great way to train functional frontal plane strength. With prerequisite strength and experience, this movement can be loaded rather significantly. With both hands holding the kettlebell and your feet shoulder-width apart, initiate your first swing. As the kettlebell ascends, adduct one leg in so that both feet are directly under your hips as the kettlebell reaches the peak of its path. Once the kettlebell peaks, abduct the other leg so that both feet are back at shoulder-width apart as the kettlebell descends between your legs. This movement can be done alternating directions each step, or continued for a set number of reps in one direction before returning to the start position. Translating the hips is the most common error during this exercise. Cue the participant to keep their hips in the middle of the stance and reinforce inner unit activation. Another good frontal plane exercise is the lateral lunge swing. Whereas the lateral kettlebell swing includes a bell swing in the sagittal plane, the lateral lunge swing uses a side swing action in the frontal plane. This promotes greater range and loading on the trunk and hip abductors. Holding the kettlebell in the contralateral hand using a pronated grip, start the exercise by stepping sideways into a lateral lunge while swinging the bell in the same direction. The lead action leg should flex while simultaneously rotating the trunk and reaching the bell into the frontal plane. Once the bell reaches neutral gravity, pull it back and ascend by extending the hip and knee and adducting the action leg to the start position. The bell will swing by the body at this time. Once the kettlebell peaks in the opposite direction, re-abduct the leg to descend into the lunge. This movement can be done alternating directions each step or continued for a set number of reps in one direction before returning to the start position. The reverse lunge with single arm press is not unique to the kettlebell, but the use of the object provides variation. Adding a new stimulus to a practice movement can improve client focus. Start by holding the kettlebell in a front rack position with the feet hip-width apart. Step backwards into a reverse lunge with the leg on the same side that you are holding the kettlebell. This causes contralateral loading, as the front leg will be opposite the load, which is easier for heavier lifts, compared to ipsilateral loading. which is used to isolate the same side musculature. As you descend into the reverse lunge, simultaneously press the kettlebell overhead. You should reach the bottom of the lunge at the same time your arm reaches full extension overhead with the kettlebell. As you return to a standing position, lower the kettlebell at the same rate so that both feet return at the same moment the kettlebell does at the front rack position. This movement can also be performed from a Bulgarian squat. A common error for this exercise is asynchronous movements between the lower and upper body. To fix this, you can practice the movement with a lighter kettlebell or include the reverse lunge with kettlebell swing to enforce synchronicity. The reverse lunge can also be performed using rotation of the trunk. The reverse lunge to kettlebell chop swing starts from a standing position. This time, hold the kettlebell upside down at chest height from the horns. Proceed to step back into a reverse lunge as you lower and rotate the kettlebell across the front hip. Make sure to keep your chest elevated and your hips square as you rotate. In the bottom position, the kettlebell should be even with or behind the greater trochanter, with your shoulders rotated 90 degrees, if possible. Return to the standing position in one fluid motion. This movement can also be performed as a lunge rebound with swing or a Bulgarian squat. The step back with chop swing is a regression from the lunge, but can be made more difficult with the dynamic march. Start from the same position as the reverse lunge. Next, step back into a field lunge. The rear leg will be extended and your heel will be flat, increasing range of motion requirements at the ankle. As you step back, rotate the kettlebell as described in the prior movement. Since the step back takes less time than a full reverse lunge, you will need to rotate quicker. Return to the starting position, pausing for a moment before switching sides or going back in the same direction. Common errors here include external rotation causing faulty foot placement during the step back. If this occurs, remove the kettlebell and simply practice the step back until the movement pattern is perfected. And a disconnect between the step back and the chop swing. For this, cue the athlete that both the step back and kettlebell chop should start and end at the same time. To perform the ballistic row exercise, stand just behind the kettlebell with your feet hip-width apart and facing forward. Start by slightly flexing your knees and then, keeping your trunk neutral, hinge at the hips while extending one arm to grasp the bell handle. Keeping your trunk stiff, swing the kettlebell out laterally and slightly flex the arm. Once the bell reaches the terminal position, decelerate the swing back under the body. As the kettlebell nears the ground, repeat the swing back out by pulling with the lats and rhomboids. The kettlebell is an ideal instrument to make push-ups even better. The elevation provides for a better shoulder position and increases the range of motion. Start with the feet on the ground inside the width of the shoulders, in a pronated body position with the hands on the handles of each kettlebell, position just outside the width of the shoulders. Start by lowering the body between the kettlebell handles to reach the deepest position without touching the floor. Then extend the arms evenly to the start position while keeping the body rigid. In the next two series, we will cover functional kettlebell exercises, starting with kettlebell squat curl. This exercise joins the dynamic musculature of the squat with kinetic momentum management from a changing center of mass. From the start position, descend into the squat position while simultaneously extending the arms. Descend deep enough to where the bell nearly contacts the floor, and then transition fluidly to return to the start position. This exercise uses flow, so it should not stop at the bottom or top of the movement. Errors to avoid include losing a neutral pelvic position to a posterior tilt. This is often due to inadequate trunk stability. And not flexing the knees and hips simultaneously, causing a forward lean. The tibial and spinal angles should mirror each other. The next exercise is the windmill, which focuses on the lateral musculature, challenging both strength and mobility across the hip. This exercise also starts in an athletic stance, with the feet just outside shoulder-width apart, but now you hold the kettlebell in the front rack position. This movement starts by hitching the kettlebell to an extended arm position. Now, holding this position, reach the opposite arm to the ground, translating the hip to accommodate the rotation. Reach the terminal point of motion, and then back upwards to reattain the start position. Another well-known functional exercise is the Turkish get-up. This exercise is rooted in Turkey as a total body movement. It poses challenges to both stability and mobility as one rises from the ground to the standing position. The exercise begins on the ground in a supine position. The feet should be shoulder-width apart with the ankles neutral. Start by grasping the kettlebell handle using a supinated hand position underneath and pronated grip on top. Next, flex the ipsilateral hip and knee while pressing the bell to an extended arm position. At this point, reach the contralateral arm back and extend the hip to raise the body off the ground. Next, flex the extended knee under the body to attain an overhead lunge position and rise to your feet, finishing with a step forward. This exercise should be practiced on both sides of the body. Another key movement for function of the spine is trunk rotation, which is limited in a large portion of the population. This loaded rotation exercise encourages both strength and mobility in the trunk. It begins by assuming a seated position on the ground with the feet shoulder-width apart. Start by grasping the kettlebell horns using a supinated hand position. Keeping the hips in one place, rotate the trunk to the lateral side, following the spine with your chin. Once to the terminal range, return to the opposite side while maintaining consistent rigid positioning of the arm-trunk relationship. Common errors for this exercise include flexing the spine and not tracking with the head. If the head remains forward the entire time, it limits movement range. And uneven rotation speed between the arms and the trunk. Another popular exercise is the kettlebell hip swing. This movement emphasizes hip and trunk connectivity, while forcing the exerciser to manage the rotational inertia of deceleration forces. Starting in an athletic stance, place your feet just outside of shoulder-width apart. Pull the bell to a point just in front of your hips. Start the movement by slightly swinging the kettlebell from between your legs to one side, with the kettlebell just lateral of your front pocket. Keep your chest up and head in a neutral position. Your opposite foot should pivot and both hips and knees should be flexed about 30 to 45 degrees. Next, explosively extend your hips and knees and rotate your trunk while guiding the kettlebell in an elliptical pattern, up in front of your eyes and down to the other side. As the kettlebell transcends your body, your feet will pivot. Keep your toes almost always pointing in the general direction of the bell. Control the descent of the bell into your opposite pocket and repeat the movement. For this exercise, the common errors include not controlling the kettlebell on the descent, which can be fixed by decreasing the speed and potentially the weight to regain control of the kettlebell, and not pivoting the feet at the right moment, which can be fixed with general practice. Another functional rotation exercise is known as lateral skier with rotation. While this movement is traditionally performed with a medicine ball or plate, a kettlebell can easily be implemented for additional challenge, especially if you are limited on equipment. This is an excellent exercise to promote frontal and transverse plane power and stability. Start the movement in a ready stance, holding the kettlebell by the horns at your side, near your front pocket. Next, raise the inside leg off the ground and jump laterally while simultaneously rotating the kettlebell across the body. You should land on your opposite foot with the kettlebell at your other side, bringing the kettlebell to the lateral aspect of the body. Once balance has been obtained, repeat the movement back in the other direction. For advanced participants, the exercise is performed using a ballistic rebound. Regardless of the movement speed, the foot placement should be consistent. This means you should be landing in the same spot on each side. Once the movement has been mastered with a pause between each jump, the speed can be increased. If speed increases, it is okay to decrease the weight or distance between jumps. The two most common errors of the lateral skier exercise include jumping forward or backward, which can be corrected by using marks on the floor for improved accuracy, and lateral hip translation, which can be corrected by decreasing the jump distance and cueing inner unit activation. The last of the functional kettlebell exercises in this section is the deadlift around the world. This drill is a great functional movement to train connectivity of hip and knee extension with trunk rotation and shoulder girdle mobility. Start with your feet shoulder-width apart and the kettlebell between your feet. Lower yourself as you would a deadlift with the knees out and chest up to grip the kettlebell horns using a supinated hand position. Next, perform a deadlift, accelerating the upper half of the movement to lift the kettlebell past your waist. As the kettlebell passes your waist, guide the bell with your arms to the outside of your body and up over one shoulder. Continue the rotational inertia generated by the bell behind the head and over the other shoulder before descending back to the starting position. This movement should be performed in both directions, alternating each time at the bottom. Common errors for this exercise include disconnect between hip and knee extension and the upper body movement of the kettlebell, and flexing the spine in the bottom position. This can be helped by slowing down and reinforcing a chest-up posture during the setup. It can also be caused by poor mobility, in which case the movement can be performed with the bell on an elevated platform. Clearly, the use of any resistance device requires an appropriate warm-up. Due to the integration of muscle systems during kettlebell workouts, it is important to warm up with similar patterns that reflect the resisted activity in part or whole. Often considered an intensity ramp-up, using a progressive model is ideal to properly prepare the body for intense work. And the more intense the workout, the longer the warm-up needs to be. It should move from gross to more finite actions, and intensity should be within 10% of the starting effort. When gross movements are initially employed, there exists a couple rules of thumb. Firstly, we move backwards before forwards as the posterior chain employs more mass in the recruitment patterns, allowing joints time to warm up, and we emphasize movement patterns over muscles. Secondly, we progress through unilateral activities to promote range of motion with heightened joint control and activation before focusing on bilateral activities. For instance, a reverse lunge with overhead reach allows for better progressive mobility since the pelvis is stabilized, providing for improved range of motion. And the split stance allows for greater movement capacity as there exists less forward drag from the latissimus dorsi and pecs in the sagittal plane. Since the most common restrictions limit the effectiveness of kettlebell training, they should be addressed first. This includes limitations to overhead reaching, caused by tightness in the lats and pecs, mobility and activation issues with the lower back and hip extensors, and skeletal compensations associated with tight hip flexors and quadriceps. Let's take a look at some common warm-up exercises that address these issues and promote physical readiness. Since there exists more muscle in the posterior chain than the anterior chain, it makes sense to start there. Elements of posterior chain limitations include tightness in the gastrocnemius, limiting dorsiflexion, tightness in the hamstrings and glute maximus, causing pelvic instability and limitations in flexion range of motion, and tightness in the thoracolumbar region, limiting trunk flexion and central stability. The sequence of exercises employed for this area includes good mornings with reach, Romanian deadlifts or RDLs, split stance good mornings, and split stance RDLs. This order progressively prepares the back and hamstrings. Reverse lunges can be added to the mix as they place limited stress on the knee and ankle and contribute to a heightened state of readiness. Adding arm movements and resistance when appropriate can further amplify the benefit for intermediate and advanced users. To address the hip and trunk flexors, the lunge is directed forward, starting with field lunging with overhead reaching, and then is progressed to forward lunging with cross reaching. The prior addresses the abdominals and iliopsoas, and the latter adds in the rectus femoris. Lunges can also be added to address the frontal plane muscles of the lateral chain. Lateral lunges hold value in addressing the short adductors, gracilis, and semitendinosus while activating the abductors. And forward lunges with lateral leaning and rotation address the trunk lateral flexors and rotators. Adding outreached arms and implements such as a weighted rod or medicine ball further add to the benefit. Similar to any progressive exercise model, the activities should be placed in proper order of execution so that residuals from the prior exercise benefit the latter. Ideally, programming these movement-based warm-ups using the fascial lines in a functional sequence provides the best results. It is common to start using the posterior chain, then sequence to anterior and lateral chain exercises. An example would be sequencing a good morning with reach to a reverse lunge to lateral squat swings. Then one could build on these exercises by sequencing split stance good mornings with reach to forward lunges with rotation to lateral lunges with cross reach. 3 rounds of each sequence will provide for good foundational readiness before moving to harder flow patterns. Adding a heavier bell and performing some common movements will further increase neuromuscular preparation. Performing 2 rounds of Romanian deadlifts, to bell squats, to lateral lunges with cross reaches will further the benefits of progressive dynamic muscle contractions before adding in the ballistic swing sequence. Remember, the goal is to progress to the level of training employed in the workout. Therefore, a warm-up for a beginner is not the same as the preparation used for advanced exercisers. Basic flow patterns can be used to introduce the rotational inertia generated by the kettlebell. They can also be used to integrate trunk management via central controls as the bell swings. The first movement requires a circular flow of the bell around the body, named coincidentally, around the body pass. This exercise allows the trunk to follow circular activation patterns as the bell flows around the hips. Progressive action utilizes cooperative movement of the hips to optimally manage the bell. The hips should not be rotated to enhance trunk activity. When doing the around the body pass, switch directions to cover both functions of the obliques and provide balanced activation. Once this movement pattern has been managed, the next flow is called the upper body halo. This activity utilizes core muscles in conjunction with the shoulders and arms. The elevated height of the bell causes more central stabilization, and the rotational direction influences shoulder activation. The cervical spine should express limited movement. Rather, the bell should experience the increased range from the body. This means starting with a light enough bell for absolute control, and like the around the body pass, perform the halo in both directions. Next, the flow moves down the body to manage the bell with the trunk and hips. The figure 8 exercise passes the bell between the legs to assume an external lateral position as it swings around the leg. The most common error is colliding with the legs, so be sure to establish appropriate flow distance. Due to the flexed hip position, this activity requires a sturdy middle so as to not round the back. The next flow sequence begins with the kettlebell deadlift pull. It starts with the kettlebell approximately between the anterior aspects of the feet in front of the body when standing in a neutral position. Simply reach downward, emphasizing the piston maneuver, simultaneously flexing the knees and hips to grasp the handle. Next, draw the bell back as you stand up. It will swing into a neutral position between the legs. The goal of the exercise is to familiarize yourself with the flow of the bell in the sagittal plane, as this will be paramount for swings and Olympic sequences. Repeating this activity also provides execution of counterbalancing, so the bell is controlled by the body rather than vice versa. The next step in the flow pattern is to pull to a full swing. From the same start position, use the piston maneuver to stand up so that all joints move collectively and evenly. Here, the common error is extending the knees too rapidly, putting the body in an overflexed trunk position, stressing the back. Once this movement has been mastered, the classical kettlebell exercises can be employed. Programming workouts using kettlebells may be done as complements to other workout modalities, such as free weights. It may also be done independently using a single bell, or different sizes and multiple weights. When using the bell as a complement, the program will follow a traditional model, interjecting the kettlebell exercises in accordance with normal order based on the weight and difficulty of each exercise. This may look like a barbell clean, kettlebell snatch, barbell overhead squat, and Bulgarian squats with the kettlebell. When the kettlebell is used independently, the exercises will follow one of three directions. The standard protocol, where the exercises are ordered by how challenging they are and matched to appropriate rest intervals between each exercise. In supersets, where combinations of paired exercises are structured for an adaptation-specific purpose. Or as circuits, where the emphasis is on the metabolic challenge. In the first protocol, the program structure flows traditionally from a dynamic warm-up to ballistic exercises to strength-based exercises. The flow of ballistic to dynamic contractions accounts for exercise technique and fatigue. Here we will see cleans and snatches transition into total body swings before the dynamic squats, lunges, and presses. So exercises from the warm-up, such as the halo and around-the-body pass, would supersede warm-up swings before moving on to kettlebell cleans, snatches, goblet squats, and presses. When supersets are used, the programmed exercises start with total body movements and gravitate to more isolated activities. In all cases, the harder of the paired exercise goes first to account for the difficulty. The paired exercise is commonly an antagonistic act, or a lower-upper combination to prevent undue fatigue on stabilizers. Unilateral movements should be paired with other unilateral movements and can be matched contralaterally, meaning a reverse lunge swing performed for 6 repetitions on the right side can be paired with a swing press of 6 repetitions on the left side, using an alternating approach. This allows for optimal force production as it prevents stabilizer fatigue. Circuits using kettlebells may be done by station and multiple rounds, or as a designated number of repetitions, or for time before moving to the next exercise. Here, the exercises should flow into each other, accounting for all the desirable movements, but becoming easier as the bout goes on. The term easier suggests the hardest exercises are performed first, although the perception of easy is relative, as the metabolic effects will be more pronounced as the exercise bout continues. Again, total body ballistics are early and dynamic movements come later in the bout. Additionally, the amount of muscle recruited for the action should move from total body to lower limb to upper limb dominance. For metabolic circuits, the same bell weight can be used throughout the exercise bout. So the amount of total body force is the determining factor in program order, and one can use bilateral exercises mixed with unilateral exercises to make the activity harder or easier based on the load. For instance, a lighter bell may be challenging using unilateral ballistics, but relatively easy using bilateral dynamic activities. Generally speaking, metabolic circuits are used for conditioning and weight loss, as only transitional rest occurs between sets. With circuits, ballistic activities such as swings can be intertwined with dynamic movements like overhead squats. With circuits, the exercise order management is based on peripheral fatigue and total body blood pH, which affects heart rate and the ability to continue training properly. For this reason, harder exercises are balanced by including easier exercise right after them to allow for hydrogen buffering. Let's take a further look at some program models. As alluded to earlier, following the energy system through the workout provides for higher intensity training when proper rest intervals are employed. When looking at different adaptation goals, the load, time under tension, and rest intervals are the three key elements that differentiate the outcome. When strength and power are the goal, then the total load and speed of the movement should be matched to the recovery. The phosphagen energy system that drives these physical characteristics requires minutes of rest. Usually, a recovery period of 2 to 3 minutes is used for phosphagen-driven power and strength lifts that reach volitional failure. When the time under tension surpasses the 20-second mark, the recovery can switch to glycolytic energy management. Strengthening and endurance exercises that traverse 8 to 10 repetitions will need 30 to 75 seconds of recovery, as hydrogen clearance is more rapid than rephosphorylation of creatine phosphate, or CP, molecules. Exercisers who are in better physical shape can take less time between movements than those who are not in shape. This is consistent with metabolic circuit training. In-shape individuals can tolerate more activities and more time engaged in each, compared to newer exercisers, so programs should reflect the capabilities of the exerciser. When making power and strength programs, the order should start with CP power exercises, followed by CP strength exercises, and end with glycolytic power to strength activities. Following a warm-up, it may look like this. Double bell clean. 4 times 6 would proceed. Goblet squat to push press. 4 times 6 followed by single arm snatch. 4 times 3 each side into lateral swings. 4 times 4 up and back, ending in reverse lunge to press. 4 times 5 per side, and then kettlebell RDL, 4 times 8. A more traditional exercise bout aimed at fitness may include exercises for each major muscle group. Around the body pass, 12 times in both directions. Halo, 3 times 10. Figure 8 swings, 3 times 10. Single arm swings, 4 times 6 per side. Double kettlebell squat, 4 times 8 to 12. Kettlebell split stance RDL, 3 times 6 per side. Kettlebell double arm press, 4 times 8 to 10. Lateral skier with rotation, 3 times 5 per side. Step back with kettlebell chop swing, 3 times 8 per side, and then finish with kettlebell push-ups, 2 times maximal reps possible. Metabolic training may use a total repetition approach or rounds of activities for time setup in training stations. A common setup would look like kettlebell cleans, kettlebell hitch press, and kettlebell swings with 60 seconds rest before repeating a total of 3 times. Round 2 would become unilateral and include 1 arm clean to press on the right side, 1 arm clean to press on the left side, single leg RDL on the right side, and single leg RDL on the left side, with 60-second rest before repeating a total of 3 times. Round 3 would then utilize kettlebell overhead squat, then kettlebell push-ups, ending in kettlebell trunk rotation. Again, 3 rounds of each would be employed with 60 seconds of rest in between. As you can see, there are numerous ways to program kettlebell activities for different purposes. And as mentioned before, while they can serve as a single implement in an exercise program, they also nicely fit into fitness and sports-based programs to complement barbell and dumbbell activity where more diverse weighting can occur. Look to mix the activities across phases of training to help maintain residual effects once each kettlebell exercise has been mastered. The first series of exercises will cover squat and deadlift progressions. These exercises involve dynamic voluntary contractions and are considered structural lifts as they promote strength and stability across varied movement ranges. Let's start with the kettlebell goblet squat, which is an excellent exercise to introduce new clients to the unfamiliar center of mass of the kettlebell. The goblet squat is essentially a front squat, but instead of a barbell hold, which is limited by mobility, the kettlebell is held in the front rack position, similar to using a medicine ball. Lift the kettlebell by gripping the horns from the outside position. Once in the front rack position, press your forearms against the bell with the upper arms, cradling the rib cage. The handle should roughly be the same height as your neck. From a frontal view, it will be just under the chin. From here, flex the hips and knees simultaneously using a body piston motion to prevent backward migration of the hips. Slowly descend, bracing the core to keep the chest elevated and head neutral. Your knees should be tracking toward your pinky toes to prevent medial lateral sway of the femur. At the bottom position, the knees should reach the toes or migrate slightly over to attain a higher torso angle. It is important to prevent a forward lean that causes the chest to drop. During the concentric portion, think about pushing against the weight to raise the body in sync. This will encourage you to keep your chest up as you extend the hips and knees in a synchronized fashion. Common errors for the goblet squat include lowering the kettlebell and chest on the descent and sitting too far back, causing a vertical shin angle. Other errors common to squats include inward migration of the knees. Cue the knees towards the pinky toes. Lateral shifting or translation of the hip, which requires a slower descent. Migrating into a posterior pelvic tilt at the bottom position. This can be corrected by bracing the transverse abdominis and pelvic floor. And outward foot rotation or heel elevation at the bottom position, often caused by tightness in the gastrocnemius and poor ankle mobility. The single-arm kettlebell squat presents a new challenge due to asymmetrical loading, as the bell is held in a single-arm front rack position instead of by the horns. Start with the kettlebell in the front rack position as seen during a single-arm clean receive. While the movement is like a goblet squat, the challenge is maintaining an upright torso in all planes of motion. Despite the asymmetrical loading, keep from leaning away from the weight. Most exercisers prefer to extend the contralateral arm as a form of counterbalance. Brace the core and descend just like the goblet squat while maintaining symmetrical positioning and no translation toward the bell. To increase the loading challenge, we can add another kettlebell. The double-arm kettlebell squat is symmetrically loaded, providing for improved stability, but creates a new challenge due to the forward center of mass of the front rack position. Here you can hold each kettlebell independently or interlock the fingers. With both options, make sure to keep your forearms vertical and brace the trunk. Once you have a stable start position, complete the movement just like the goblet or single-arm squat, being sure to avoid a forward lean or posterior migration of the hips. To increase the difficulty placed on central and peripheral stabilizers, use a single-arm overhead kettlebell squat. This exercise employs asymmetrical loading held above the shoulder using an extended arm. This greatly challenges mobility, so individuals who are too tight may have additional difficulty with this lift. To start, perform the single arm clean to establish the front rack position. Next, hitch the bell overhead to an extended arm position. Due to the added challenges, use a slightly wider foot stance. Once the stable start position is established, repeat the action of the single arm squat while attempting to maintain an upright torso. Due to the height and asymmetry, the torso will lean away from the bell, but the hips and knees should maintain symmetry at the bottom position. The opposite arm is used as a counterbalance. To rise, push upward through the kettlebell to maintain proper mechanics during the entire concentric phase. Focusing on the external load provides for better trunk stabilization and movement efficiency. While you can perform traditional deadlifts with kettlebells, for many, they tend to be too light for strength adaptations. However, kettlebells can be well used in HIIT programs emphasizing metabolic conditioning. Their utility is best seen with hinged or Romanian deadlift movements. These actions reduce the amount of total knee flexion at the bottom position and increase activation of the posterior chain. The Romanian deadlift, commonly termed RDL, is primarily driven by the proximal hip extensor. Initiate the descent by flexing the knees to about 15 degrees while simultaneously pushing your hips back in a hinged movement. Do not arch the lower back, but rather posteriorly migrate the hips. Pull slightly back on the kettlebell with your lats to keep the center of mass closer to your toes. Forward migration of the bell will unfavorably direct the load to the lower back. Once the kettlebell nears the ground, return to the vertical position by extending the hips and knees. Each rep should strive to attain a maximal functional range of motion, with the lowest point during the eccentric phase occurring when the glenohumeral joints align with the hips. The split stance kettlebell RDL places greater flexibility demands on the hip extensors, and the stance used is an excellent bridge to progress to the single leg RDL. To initiate this exercise, stand up with the kettlebell as seen during the standard kettlebell RDL. Then, step back about 12 inches with one foot. Both knees should be slightly flexed with your toes pointed forward. Keeping your chest elevated and scapula retracted, hinge at the hips, pushing the bell to the toes. As you descend, you should feel an exaggerated stretch on the front hamstring and back gastrocnemius. A key point is to ensure the hip does not rotate laterally under the fascial tension. Once the shoulders and hips align, or full functional range is reached, return to the standing position. This movement can be performed for consecutive reps with the same leg forward or in a more difficult and dynamic marching fashion by alternating each leg per repetition. To add further challenge in range and stability, the RDL can be performed with a single anchor. The single leg RDL is difficult due to the significant balance and coordination needed to perform the lift from such a small base of support. Therefore, single leg RDLs challenge hip and trunk stability as well as proprioception and mobility. Using a light kettlebell to start assists with the balance component, allowing for focus on technique. When the kettlebell is too heavy, the body rotates at the hips in compensation, which negatively changes the activation pattern. From the start position, raise one foot off the ground and slightly flex the opposite hip and knee. As you descend, you will simultaneously flex the grounded hip while extending the other leg straight back behind you, lifting the heel upward. Be sure not to rotate the hip. The leg behind you should remain fully extended at the hip and knee, with the neutral ankle and toes pointed directly downward. Hold the kettlebell with both hands, pulling it back toward the grounded foot. Continue to flex at the supporting hip and reach backward with your raised heel until the trunk, thigh, and shin are parallel to the ground, or relative functional range is reached. Once at the terminal position, return to the start with your raised foot off the floor if possible. If a balance check is required, only tap the toe on the ground. Adding 2 kettlebells during a single leg RDL will open the circuit of the loading condition. So while the loading can certainly be increased, balance becomes easier due to the offsetting loads. Next, we will transition into performing ballistic swings and receives. In this segment, we will cover the single arm swing, clean, and snatch. Each has unique benefits but also common errors. Let's start with the swing. To perform the single arm swing, start by standing about 1 foot behind the kettlebell with your feet just outside shoulder width apart. The degree of hip abduction should reflect the degree of external rotation of the femur. So for most people, this will be about 10 to 15 degrees from the anatomical position. To initiate the movement, slightly flex your knees and your hips while keeping the spine neutral by bracing the trunk. Keeping one arm at your side, continue to flex your hips and knees while you reach your other arm forward to the kettlebell handle. Then, firmly grab the handle using a pronated grip. Next, using a single motion, extend your knees and simultaneously raise your hips while you pull the kettlebell back between your legs without rotating your trunk, and ensure the weighted shoulder does not dip. There are a variety of teaching methods for what type of hand position you should have in the bottom of the single arm swing. It is recommended to use a slightly internally rotated position as this places less stress on the shoulder joint. Keeping the shoulders square, extend your hips and knees forcefully, contracting your glutes, hamstrings, and quadriceps. Your arm and kettlebell should follow the movement arc at the same velocity as your hip and knee extension. Be sure to maintain a firm grip on the kettlebell. There should be a straight line through your forearm and wrist to the horns of the kettlebell. This indicates sustained rotational inertia forces are captured. The first swing should raise the kettlebell to waist height. There should be a moment of weightlessness. Maintain a stable body position and keep your shoulders square. You should not rotate. As the bell starts to descend, flex your hips and knees simultaneously to attenuate the energy of the kettlebell as it decelerates through your legs. The forearm of the swing arm should be just against the inner thigh. Repeat the extension step. Maintain squared shoulders as you forcefully extend your hips and knees until it reaches a slightly higher position. Each subsequent swing should raise the kettlebell further along the movement arc until it peaks at eye level. As the bell force increases, you will need to lean back slightly to counterbalance the weight of the kettlebell at the top position so the center of mass aligns with the base of support. Once you are swinging to eye level, let the kettlebell follow its natural path on the descent. When the kettlebell is at waist height, you will first bring your trunk forward slightly, eliminating the leaning position, and flow into hip and knee flexion, controlling the bell into the deep catch position before repeating the swing. Common errors of the single-arm swing include lifting with the arms. You should not be trying to raise the kettlebell like a pull or frontal raise. Your resistance arm is guiding the kettlebell along the movement arc. You should be able to generate enough rotational inertia in the bottom half of the swing where your fingers are only guiding the kettlebell, not lifting. Dropping the loaded shoulder. Keep the shoulders squared to balance even trunk force. This prevents the trunk from rotating and reduces the risk of being yanked by the kettlebell. A usual fix is to hold the opposite arm outward at the side of the body. And lastly, not fully extending the hips and knees at the top of the swing. This limits the benefits of the kettlebell swing. Cueing to squeeze the glutes and quads at the top can encourage correct posture and avoid a related error, reflexing the hips or knees at the top position. The next exercise we will look at is the single arm clean. The single arm clean stance, body position, and first swing are all consistent with the single arm swing. It only begins to differ in the line of pull once the kettlebell gets above waist height. This keeps the bell closer to the center of mass, so as the kettlebell passes the waist, it is pulled up using a high pull motion. Your scapula should elevate as your elbow flexes through a diagonal line of pull toward the receive position. At the last stage of the high pull motion, you will want to draw a big circle with your elbow so it moves around and under the bell until the kettlebell is resting gently against your forearm and you are leaning slightly backward. Your forearm should meet the kettlebell smoothly and not slam down on your forearm. In the front rack position, your wrist should be stacked vertically over your elbow, with your inner bicep, tricep, and forearm flat against your torso. To start the downward motion of the kettlebell, provide a slight pop with your shoulder to dislodge the bell from the front rack position, and guide it with your fingers back into the bottom of the swing, attenuating the load with your knees and hips. Common errors of the single arm clean include poor timing on the catch, causing the bell to slam into your body, forearm. Work on timing with a lighter kettlebell and practice cushioning the bell as it contacts your body. Allowing a receive position of the kettlebell too far laterally from the body. This occurs when the participant yanks too hard during the high pull motion. Instruct them to take the elbow vertical as opposed to lateral before it drops under. And over-swinging the bell forward. Cue to pull it up the body vertically. The single arm snatch is the next progression from the clean. Instead of receiving the kettlebell to your front rack position, you will pull the bell higher to receive it overhead. This position does take considerable practice to get comfortable with, so first practice the movement with light weight that can be managed safely. As with the clean, the single arm snatch will only differ from the single arm swing once the kettlebell reaches the waist. Therefore, the first steps are the same. Since the distance the kettlebell must travel in the snatch versus the clean is considerably longer, a more aggressive swing and high pull motion is required. Start by taking 2 to 3 warm-up swings, taking the kettlebell higher on each swing before attempting to receive it overhead. As the kettlebell passes your waist, perform the same high pull motion as with the clean, but instead of transitioning immediately into the receive, continue to pull the kettlebell until it is at eye level. At this time, your elbow will be flexed. The increased pull weight needed for the bell to reach the receive position should come from the drive of the legs and hips. As the kettlebell reaches the terminal height, rotate your elbow inward slightly and punch your hand through the handle to form a high reach position. When done correctly, the forearm will gently meet the bell as it reaches neutral gravity. The rotational inertia of the bell should allow the bell to safely stack the wrist directly over your elbow, shoulder, hip, and ankle. You should be able to hold the kettlebell overhead with minimal effort. Some coaches teach the athlete to rotate the torso and drop the loaded shoulder in the bottom position, as this will allow a greater yanking motion for the upward swing to generate force. We prefer teaching a neutral torso to focus on rotational trunk stability, commonly called anti-rotation. Common errors occur during single-arm kettlebell snatches can include mistiming the receive and having the kettlebell slam into your forearm. This is the most common error, often caused by a mistimed punch through the handle. To work on this, gradually increase the height of the snatch and punch from head height to the terminal position. Yanking the kettlebell straight up instead of swinging the kettlebell into the snatch position. This defeats the purpose of using the kettlebell over a dumbbell. Performing a series of 3 to 5 gradually higher swings with the swing arm fully extended at the elbow will help with the issue. And especially among new exercisers, we see upward swinging of the kettlebell without proper pulling. This creates an unfavorable arc and rigid receive, which can cause injury. The snatch must include a pulling action, capitalizing on the momentum of the swing.